Welcome everyone to our podcast, Cultivating Curriculum. I'm Sam.
And I'm Ryan, and in today's episode we are inquiring about two topics of race in the classroom, but more significantly I will be discussing why the exploration of critical race theory is an issue worth fighting for.
And I will be exploring why the topic of slavery should be taught in classrooms and how teachers can approach it. This means we'll be breaking down what exactly critical race theory is, why discussions of race and slavery are shied away from in the classroom, and more importantly, why they shouldn't be shied away from.
And this also means looking into ways that these conversations can be thoroughly investigated and comfortably approached by students and teachers.
And we chose to investigate this topic today because as history majors, if our classes have shown us anything, it's that these issues do not get better by ignoring them. So we need to find appropriate ways of educating our students so they can effectively navigate their way through our current political and social climate.
So let's start off by answering the question, what is critical race theory? It's a term that I'm sure you've all heard on various platforms in the last few years, but what does it actually stand for? There are 5 main concepts that make up critical race theory, as broken down in Nicholas Hartlepp's article entitled Critical Race Theory, an examination of its past, present, and future implications. Number 1, racism is ordinary and not aberrational. There is a standard level of racism that exists in everyday life, removing any uniqueness to its independent events. Number 2 is the idea of an interest convergence, which refers to the progress of civil rights being reliant on the merging of white and black interests. Number 3, race is a social construct rather than being based on any biological data. Number 4, there is the idea of storytelling and counter-storytelling, which centers around the way that pieces of history are explained away in the classroom setting. Counter-storytelling holds this practice accountable and actively works to disparage these ideas. And finally, number 5, the notion that white people have actually been recipients of civil rights legislation over that of the black population. Each of these 5 principles makes up a different crucial aspect of the racial issues that plague many social infrastructures in North America. Understanding them individually is a great first step to understanding why these theories are fought for as important parts of the education system. Now, these concepts are what have become incredibly contentious in the eyes of many government officials in the United States in the last few years. These public figures have expressed concern for the potential spread of an anti-American rhetoric. Fear has spread around what is perceived to be divisive messaging. Rashawn Ray and Alexandra Gibbons wrote in their article on the issue that the root of this dilemma stems from a deep-seated inability to separate self-identity from that of the history of the nation. This means that imparting this knowledge to a new generation is perceived as a very personal attack. These same minds have taken it upon themselves to label this form of education as activist indoctrination, citing extremist views being perpetrated onto a younger generation. While these concepts may be perceived as revolutionary, their history dates back to the 1970s. This means that they have been thoroughly established as part of the racial literature for generations. Nothing about these concepts are new to the academic stream of consciousness. Parents have started citing the critical race theory as a grievance in order to encompass a variety of issues. This idea is brought up by Peter Green and used in the Call to Pedagogy podcast episode on this issue. So many do not truly understand what critical race theory represents. It expands so far beyond any one white person's impact on racist practices, and rather the institutions that have been founded on these racist practices, such as the criminal justice system. This ability to choose whether or not to learn about such subjects emphasizes the prejudice and privilege established within these systems. It is such a clear abuse of white privilege, and generational trauma has and continues to affect those who've experienced the extensive history of racial bias. Within the education system, there is also the concern that children may struggle to conceptualize the gravity of the material associated with critical race theory. When diving deeper into this thought process, one can find a series of testimonies from students citing frustration with the lack of information that was provided for them surrounding such issues during their educational careers. It has been demonstrated time and time again that censorship is never the answer when faced with a problem that makes us uncomfortable, and the Call to Pedagogy podcast does excellent work at explaining that concept exactly. The Call to Pedagogy podcast works to explain the context of this issue within the educational field and provides some effective ways for teachers to manage the issue within their own classrooms. It is a delicate issue to undertake, as there have been many cases reported of teachers being stalked and threatened for maintaining these theories as a part of their curriculum. There are 2 teachers whose testimonies are a feature in the Cult of Pedagogy podcast that demonstrate this reality quite effectively. The woman identified as Mary describes moments of internal censorship within her school system. "It is almost like I can't have passion," she said during her interview. She cited an inability to truly teach in the ways that she wants to for fears of repercussions from parents. Excluding these theories that teachers find so crucial entirely from the school system does no good for these students, as it takes away from their opportunity to learn how to identify racism and understand the beauty in diversity. Knowing the history of such impactful issues also allows students to be able to identify such practices when they start to show up in their own community. Working to undo harmful policies, understanding the diversity statements and policies set in place previously within your workplace are all great first steps to take to make an impact locally. It is important to be proactive. When these issues have such a stark impact on the way that our society understands one another, it is crucial to be one step ahead in your research and understanding of current events. On a broader scale, understanding censorship laws, studying the logistics of the opposition, and most importantly, educating those fueled by misinformation on the true benefits of learning the extent of critical race theory are steps crucial to influence the outcome of the cause. Combining local and broader actions is the most effective way to see true impact. Encouraging students to advocate for what they are interested in learning also amplifies the message for legislators. When students take responsibility for their education, engagement will no longer have to be a concern, and the important messages will also be able to be effectively delivered. Discussion of race is not something to fear. It may only grow students' empathy and awareness for the world around them. Our society has proven that these fundamental issues are not going away anytime soon, so removing education around it will do nothing to impact the quality of interracial interactions. Delving deeper into how this prejudice came to be is another great way to work these concepts into students' understanding, which is effectively achieved through the history of slavery.
Now, how does this connect to the history of slavery? Well, the issues that teachers are faced with in regards to critical race theory are very similar to teaching slavery, and the topics themselves are also very interconnected. When we really start getting into issues of race in the classroom, especially social studies classrooms, these conversations about critical race theory tend to arise around colonialism or discussions of slavery, and until recently there has been a lack of thorough and mindful explorations surrounding the topic, which is where educators and curriculums have gone wrong in the past. And similar to your points, Ryan, on critical race theory, to explore and fix these issues means you have to understand 3 things: why the topic has been shied away from, why it should be discussed, and how it should be approached. Now, we could go into a larger discussion of what slavery is and how it originated, but that could be an entire podcast on its own. So if you're listening and you do not know its origins, I encourage you to look into a podcast video or book that covers it. I will, however, start with the first question about why slavery is a topic that is feared. Well, I think this is somewhat self-explanatory. Jennifer Gonzalez explores this topic a bit more in the Cult of Pedagogy episode, where she explores topics of slavery in the classroom. And the answer to the question is that it's just not an easy history. For many, slavery is not a topic that is easily digestible, and this is largely because we still see the after effects of it in our current society. The racism that fueled the justification of the slave trade is very much alive, and while it's not visible to everyone, this is exactly why it's important to discuss this in the classroom. There's a large fear from teachers and students about saying the wrong thing or marginalizing students of color, and so it just doesn't get discussed. And like Ryan mentioned previously, we see a large amount of criticism from parents who are concerned about these topics being discussed in classrooms, but this is not the right approach or an excuse to shy away from it. This brings me to my next question: why it should not be shied away from. And the simple answer here is that it not only robs students of an honest and well-rounded education, but also these issues are not going to go away. There are many contemporary implications, and slavery has a legacy of white supremacy, which has become a justification for racism that's very much evident today. Students cannot understand the world and political climate around them without understanding how embedded slavery is in all aspects of history and society. When slavery is taught like a simple chapter of history or it gets 15 pages in a textbook, it automatically dehumanizes those who experience slavery and those who continue to feel its implications. It also is not as complicated to teach as some may think. There are tons of resources that I'll get into later that can assist students and teachers in exploring the topic. And if it's embedded into world history as opposed to taught like a chapter, it highlights how important and prevalent this history has been through the years, while also validating that this isn't a simple one-chapter history that can be easily broken down and then moved on from. But the question is still, how exactly do we approach something like this, and what are the techniques or things that we need to be mindful of? And there's not necessarily a simple solution. It really boils down to educators themselves, making sure that changes happen in their classroom and working with students or other educators to work out any kinks in their lesson plans or ways they're approaching the subject. In a Canadian context, this is going to look different than an American classroom. Our social studies curriculums tend to focus from the inside out, so in the past this has meant Canadian history, British history, because colonization, and then ancient history. And while there's a lot of room in there to discuss colonialism and slavery, it gets brushed aside or taught from a Eurocentric pro-colonialism standpoint. Now, there are tactics to avoid Eurocentrism, for instance, replacing dated textbooks or ditching textbooks altogether for collections of primary documents is a great way to avoid a whitewashed version of history. And the other big issue is that not everybody has the same background knowledge or experience with these topics, and we're talking about all grades here, so these hard histories are going to be explored differently depending on the grade and group you are teaching. However, there are so many opportunities to make the lesson plans more inclusive and diverse so students can get this well-rounded education that encompasses more than just the white experience of the European world. And this is really best approached by teachers going out and finding the right resources for their classroom. Thankfully, there are a lot out there, and they don't require any deep exploration into the depths of the internet or subscriptions or fees. For instance, a great resource for Canadian social studies teachers is a website called Teaching African Canadian History, which has workshops, articles, primary sources, lesson plans, and more that can help teachers find the right ways to approach these topics. And what's great about this website is that it really embodies the idea of integrating Black experiences into histories beyond just the slave trade, which is a whole other aspect of history that is important. The classroom is more diverse and welcoming to students when history is covering everyone's experiences from a time period, and teaching African Canadian history has great resources for this kind of approach to history. The Cult of Pedagogy podcast I mentioned earlier also featured Hanson Kwame Jeffries, who is an American history professor and works actively to reshape curriculums. In the episode, he mentioned another great online website, which is Learning for Justice, and he was actually part of creating this website. And the website was brought together in an attempt to revamp history classrooms in the U.S., and this is really, it's really similar layout to the other website I mentioned. So there are workshops, lesson plans, student texts to go along with lessons, and great strategies offered for teachers who want to properly integrate the history of slavery into histories they are teaching their students. And it's also founded by this large group of scholars outside of just Jeffries, so everything is historically and factually honest and reliable. Overall, the takeaway here is that implementing the history of slavery into social studies classrooms is not as challenging as it might seem. There are a ton of resources, even outside of the ones I mentioned, that can help guide more diverse and inclusive ways of teaching history, and ones that recognize the truth behind our current capitalist society that we live in, which is so important for our future generations to understand, especially in times like this where social change is at the forefront of political agendas and people are rallying together to make a change. We can't expect students to go out and educate themselves on these topics, and having an honest and factual way of teaching them these histories has the potential of making some serious social change. It was really important to Ryan and I to explore this topic because we are both like the students that Ryan mentioned earlier who are frustrated that we did not get this kind of education.
Definitely, and it took until we got into university for us to even learn about these topics. Nowhere in any of the textbooks I was exposed to did it mention diverse experiences of history or the slave trade in any way whatsoever.
So we hope to see some kind of change, and thankfully it seems like change is on its way. It's just important that these messages start to spread around. And that's the podcast. Again, as a reminder, our goal here was to explore why the exploration of critical race theory is an issue worth fighting for, and to explore why the topic of slavery should be taught in the classroom and how teachers can approach it.
Hopefully our arguments and explanations were strong enough to give you the opportunity to stretch your understanding of critical race theory, the history of slavery, and why they are an imperative part of students' education.
But at the very least, you gain some knowledge about racial issues in the classroom. If you want to do some more of your own research on this subject matter, we would encourage you to check out more of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast's content. Conducting a general Google search will also provide some very interesting sources on these issues. A subject as important as this deserves as much time you are willing to give it. Thanks for listening.